The following program contains the use of racial epithets in historical context and to recount personal experiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
The first day of school, my brother and I had bus assignments, and we collected students and other buses to drive up to South Boston High School.
Your old street annex right over here, first 2 buses, please.
I went up to Southie High. There was staging for the television cameras, and the first one I noticed was the BBC. We all knew something was going to happen.
As the kids were getting out the buses, there was a line of police holding back residents from South Boston, screaming at the black students. We were fearful for our lives.
We were not pushing for desegregation because of the Brotherhood of Man concept. Where there were white students, that's where the money went.
How adults in Boston could not have come up with a better plan, it still baffles me.
I'm not for all this. I don't care. My one will not go to school, but it's tearing them apart. I wouldn't care if they were green or purple. It's the idea of putting my kid on a bus when I have a school right across the street from where they should go.
White families and even some black families felt that the decision of where their children should go to school should be up to them.
First of all, busing will never work in this city. Never. They will not take the rights away from these people.
Many black parents were saying, this is crazy. No, we can't send our kids into the lion's den.
I don't want to bus my child to any school. I want to have a good school in my community where my child can go and get just as much good education as anybody else.
The battle over busing in Boston exposed an important truth, that the majority of white Americans didn't actually support civil rights if it meant they had to actually address racial inequality in their own cities.
The people of Boston elected people to public office who campaigned on deliberately racist platforms.
If you ask me, you know where I stand. You know where I stand.
Shoot all the niggas. Why? Because why should they come over here and wreck the city?
It was the ugliest that I've ever experienced human nature, and the most fraught with danger and concern that we were at the precipice of anarchy, civil war, a race riot.
It's not a question of whether the Constitution can be enforced. It's only a question of at what cost.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon,
on June 11th, 1963, President John Kennedy calls for a national press conference, and all 3 networks broadcast it. It rivets the attention of the country.
the Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about 1/2 as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place, on the same day.
I was at home watching him on TV, and to hear a president of the United States acknowledge the depth of the racial challenges was just remarkable and uplifting. In the middle of the struggles that are going on in the South, to take a side like that on our side, it was like revolutionary.
There can be no submission to the theory that the central government...
Earlier in the day, Governor George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door and said that in my tenure as governor here, Negroes will never attend the University of Alabama.
I'm asking from you an unequivocal assurance that you will not bar entry to these students, to Vivian Malone and to James Hood.
Kennedy finally saw how rigid and devastating the racism in the South had become, that it was no longer possible to stay on the sidelines.
This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union.
Part of the irony of Kennedy's speech was that in Boston, the NAACP is appearing before the Boston School Committee in an equally dramatic moment at the same time.
It was a very hot night. There was no air conditioning. The windows were wide open in search of air. You could hear downstairs demonstrators chanting and singing freedom songs. Inside the school committee headquarters, Ruth Batson presented her case to the all-white school committee.
Ruth Batson really is on a mission to get the Boston School Committee to admit that there was de facto segregation in the schools and to do something about it.
Louise Day Hicks, South Boston lawyer, chairperson of the school committee, said to Mrs. Batson, "Mrs. Batson, we don't segregate the schools. We only assign students to schools closest to where they live. So we're not accepting this notion, and we are not going to do anything about what you're talking about."
We made our presentation and everything broke loose. We were completely rejected that night, and we left battle-scarred.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote, who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay?
So here you've got President Kennedy making an impassioned speech to the nation in this morally rich position that he's taking, juxtaposed with the Boston School Committee, which is presented with this opportunity. And it does exactly the opposite. Dug its heels in.
This meeting is a turning point. It ignited a movement. The civil rights movement came to Boston on June 11th, 1963.
In the 1960s. Boston was a rundown has-been of a city. The middle class was on its way out. It was left as a place for the poor and working class. It was a city of Waldorf and Hayes Bickford cafeterias and bookie joints and newspapers blowing down the streets.
Boston is sort of like the palm of your hand. You have little peninsulas going out into the harbor, whether it's Dorchester, South Boston, East Boston, North End, Charlestown. They go out into the harbor, and the downtown area is sort of the back of your hand. So you don't go through the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are their own little sort of worlds.
East Boston was the Italian neighborhood. Mattapan was the Jewish neighborhood. South Boston was the Irish neighborhood. South End was Hispanic, by and large. Right adjacent to the downtown Boston was the Chinese community. Roxbury, Lower Roxbury, and Upper Roxbury were black communities. African Americans who had been there for some 200 years, and Caribbean Americans who came in the 1900s.
10 years earlier, Boston had been a very white city. In the 1950s, you're seeing people come up from the Deep South. They're crowding into these neighborhoods where blacks are allowed to live, the South End and Roxbury. They can't move out because of racial covenants written into the deeds. And outside of those black neighborhoods, they faced tremendous discrimination.
The conditions were pretty bad, and they were deteriorating as more folks moved in.
Boston was like up south. There were patterns of racial discrimination everywhere. Black folks were invisible. It was like they didn't live in the city.
People from South Boston didn't come into Roxbury. People from Roxbury didn't go into South Boston.
We used to try to go to the St. Patrick's Day parade. Once we got to the South Boston side, we realized that, hey, we better get out of here because people started yelling at us, calling us all kinds of names. And people started chasing us.
The only time I ever saw a black person when I was growing up was when the black Jehovah's Witnesses would come down the street. My grandmother, who was from County Cork in Ireland, when she would see them coming down, she would say, "Close the blinds, don't answer the door." And I could never understand what she was so upset about. But that was the environment that I grew up in.
Boston's tradition of education is long and lustrous. It had the first school in America in Boston Latin. Up until the Depression, it was probably one of the best public school systems in the country. But then it kind of hit a downturn and became more of a political place. It was all about getting constituents jobs.
Everybody knew that if you wanted to have a promotion, if you wanted to become an assistant principal, or, God forbid, you wanted to be a principal, you had to contribute to the campaigns of the elected school committee. It was never based on merit.
Boston had really a two-tiered system of high schools. There were the district high schools, like East Boston, South Boston High School, Charlestown High School. Charlestown High School, you might only have a few kids that graduated and went to a four-year college. Then there were the exam schools. There was Boston Latin for boys, there was Girls Latin, and Boston Tech. And those schools were elite and mostly white.
As a student in training to be a teacher and visiting Boston schools and then visiting as well schools in the suburbs, the differences were extreme. So in the suburban schools, I would see these beautiful new school buildings, modern science labs, modern auditoriums. And I'd go back to visiting a school in Boston, and I'd say, like, are we in the same world, the same planet, the same state? Why are schools in Boston underfunded and disgraceful looking?
The schools in the African American community were even less well off. The school buildings were older, the resources less.
Black schools were located in some of the oldest school buildings in Boston. They were missing basic resources like paper, pencils, pens. But they also didn't have lunchrooms and they didn't have libraries in some cases or gymnasiums.
The school building, which I taught in Boston, was something out of a Charles Dickens novel. We taught 2, 3, 4 classes all in the same unpartitioned, noisy auditorium day after day. Kids there were loaded with substitute teachers. Walls were peeling paint. Blackboards were collapsing.
My elementary teachers were all white. There was nothing about Black history or the contributions of other minorities to this country. I knew all the Irish songs. The basketball coach, he had us saying, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord be with," and we're all Black kids. Most of us Baptists.
I remember we read Little Black Sambo out loud. Tremendously stereotypical African kid, the object of fun and laughter. And I saw myself in that kid. And I knew other people saw me in that kid. Later on, I was very angry about it. But when I was in the middle of it, I had to learn how to live in that environment without knowing what was wrong, only knowing that I don't feel right about this.
The fight for racial equity started more than a decade before that school committee meeting in 1963. It began with Ruth Batson.
Ruth Batson was a Roxbury resident, a mother of 3 children. She was fed up with what her children were not getting from the Boston Public Schools.
I was living in the Orchard Park Housing Project, and 2 of my children were attending the Dearborn School. And I was very concerned with their education because I had the feeling from talking with other parents in other parts of the city that the education was different.
Ruth talked to teachers about her children and asks why is there a difference between what her child is assigned and what children from predominantly white districts are assigned, such as science. She gets ridiculed and she is demeaned, so that fires her up.
I became chairperson of the NAACP Public School Committee. I gathered a group of people around me, and when we would go to white schools, we'd see these lovely classrooms, small number of children in each class. The teachers were permanent. We would see wonderful materials. When we'd go to our schools, we would see overcrowded classrooms, children sitting out in the corridors and so forth. We felt that if we moved our students to where they were spending the money, we would benefit. We certainly didn't think that just putting black and white kids together meant that black kids would improve.
She ran for school committee in the 1950s and lost. But as an activist said, she gave people spine.
She had a tough core of steel. You mess with Ruth Batson, you better be ready.
It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a television journal of the important issues of the hour.
The United States Supreme Court has made a unanimous decision. It's ruled that Negro and white pupils in our public schools must not be segregated. This will surely have a penetrating significance on all American life.
This was a decision that many African Americans had hoped for a long time. The lawyers from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had been litigating this line of cases for several years. And finally, they had this triumphant opinion that said separate black and white schools were unlawful. The black schools were invariably inferior.
Ruth Batson felt jubilation. She, thought to herself, now that Brown v. Board has been decided, this was going to open the doors for all black children, whether in the South or the North.
African-American families across the country had a right to expect that their children would no longer be sent to schools that were segregated, and that instead they would be going to schools that were integrated. That was their expectation, and that was their constitutional right.
For black activists in Boston, nothing practically changes after the Brown decision in terms of what's actually going on the ground for black children. And eventually it increases frustration because they can see with their own eyes that segregation exists in Boston, that their children are receiving second-class educations.
Another group started in 1960, a group called CBPS, Citizens for Boston Public Schools. It was started to try and do something about the schools. The only community that was interested in working with them was the black community and Ruth Batson.
In 1961, the Boston Citizens for Public Schools put together their own slate from the school committee. One of the primary candidates was Mel King, who was a leader in the African-American community.
They were running a campaign that was based on, we are interested in reforming and building a quality school system in Boston.
Louise Day Hicks is also a candidate for the Boston School Committee. She bills herself as the only mother in the race.
At that time, she was soliciting the black vote and very actively doing so in the community. Mel King didn't get elected, but Louise Day Hicks did.
So what the NAACP does is compile a bunch of statistics. And they find that 13 schools were predominantly black. And in those schools, there was a terrible case of overcrowding. One school was built to hold 600 kids, and there were more than 1,000 enrolled. They were old buildings. 4 had been condemned. The school system spends on average $275 per elementary school kid per year, but in some of these predominantly black schools, it's only spending $229. So they compile a very strong case that kids in these predominantly black schools are suffering. And it's on the merits of these statistics that they demand a meeting.
At the meeting, Ruth reminded them that they had been talking about these issues for years, that they had been trying to remind them of the plight of black students in the system, and that no one had listened.
Would you care to speculate on why the NAACP has raised this issue in Boston?
I might say that it's a national problem, and they have brought it to Boston where it does not belong.
You do not believe, then, that this agitation originated here in this city?
No, I do not.
We go prepared to the school system, and we were really innocent. We were naive. We were insulted. We were told our kids were stupid, and this is why they didn't learn. We found out that we had brought to them a wonderful political issue, and that this was an issue that was going to give their political career stability for a long time to come.
Today, Boston witnessed the Stay Out for Freedom Day, the so-called boycott by Negro students of junior and senior high schools of Boston.
When the school committee refused to do anything to respond to the NAACP, the black community decided that they had to keep the pressure on and act. Reverend James Breeden had witnessed a school stay out in the South, and he suggested doing the same thing in Boston. Let's get the black children to stay out of school for a day and to show that we represent a lot of people.
When the Stay Out of School for Freedom came, there was no question I was going to be there. I was coming out of a relatively poor family, but even as a child, I had aspirations to do better. I didn't tell my parents. Dad would be scared that that could impact him.
We identified locations where we set up freedom schools, and we filled them with music, with poetry, and with lessons, and with speakers who these young people would never have an opportunity to encounter. We helped to make the connection to the South. We helped them to understand that this freedom school was part of the civil rights movement.
Most of you came here because you understood that here in Boston, you are deprived of your rights just as much as people in Birmingham are deprived of their rights. We've taken the first real step in Boston in beginning the struggle for our freedom here.
Bill Russell, the Boston Celtics, you gave a very powerful speech today at this Freedom Sit-In. Could you tell us what you feel is the success of this Freedom Stay Out?
The important thing is that we have taken the first step, and we have, as they say, thrown the gauntlet down, and we're into the fight now, and I think we'll win.
In November 1963, there's a Boston School Committee election.
Louise Day Hicks is reelected to the school committee. She wins in a landslide. She sees that she's been rewarded for fighting against integration of schools.
Louise, early on, saw that a way of getting more votes and raising her political profile was to oppose these efforts at ending de facto segregation.
People in the Black community were frustrated that nothing was happening. They didn't win at the ballot box. They didn't get anywhere with the school committee. So 3 Black state legislators file racial imbalance bills to say that if a town or city had racially imbalanced schools, they would have to address it. Those bills went nowhere.
In February 1964, there's a second school stayout, and this one's much larger than the first one. This time, you have a number of students from suburban schools outside of Boston who come in and participate as well.
I was asked to organize students living in the suburbs to come join the stayout and to attend freedom schools and get to know kids from Boston and kids who were different from them in race and culture. And the response was amazing.
We have these 3 musicians this modern way, but integrate this room in 2 minutes. They merely said, you come down here and sit here, and you come there and sit there, and we were integrated, weren't we? I don't feel that this plan needs all that brains. I think it just needs some goodwill and some common sense.
Boston seems to be unique in the United States cities in that its school board, as far as we're able to learn, has refused to admit that de facto segregation exists in Boston and won't even talk about it. Now, this is the oddest position that any city has taken in the United States.
We saw in 1963 and 1964 an extraordinary amount of energy being used to try to move the Boston public school system. Like you never saw before. It was fierce energy.
It's like a tsunami was sitting off the coast. And these different events that were happening, Ruth Batson at the school committee, the Stayout for Freedom, picketing the school department, the sit-ins. And so the school committee, every time something like this happened, they dug their heels in even more so. They acted in ways that provoked more action on our part because they would benefit from it.
Watch your head, Joe. All right, back it up. Oh, Joe. Open up now, open up. Let's go.
What we must have is quality integrated education across the board, and we must have it in Boston. And I want you to know that I'm with you. I come here because you have come to us so often.
Martin Luther King was invited to come in April of 1965 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, which was his main organization.
Martin Luther King's visit kind of packed with meaning because he had been a student at Boston University. He had preached and given sermons at 12th Baptist Church. He met Coretta Scott King in Boston.
It was announced that there was going to be a march for freedom. We're going to meet and greet Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was our leader. He was the one that we were following.
All of my friends are there. These are people who had put their heart and soul into the activism during Boston's emerging civil rights movement, at a great risk to themselves. And here they were, being supported by this icon from out of town. It was thrilling to feel supported in that way. We walked singing freedom songs, and then at the Common, he gave one of his big speeches.
It would be demagogic and dishonest for me to say that Boston is a Birmingham, or to equate Massachusetts with Mississippi, but it would be morally irresponsible were I to remain blind to the threat to liberty, the denial of opportunity, and the crippling poverty that we face in some sections of this community.
Martin presented the city with a mirror, and he made it clear that he saw racism in the North as invidious as racism in the South. And when he held up that mirror, he's showing city and state leaders a picture that is disconcerting for them. It's disconfirming.
King, with his national following and entourage and media presence, embarrassed many state legislators who move all of a sudden with great alacrity and speed toward passage of, a Racial Imbalance Act.
The Racial Imbalance Bill, filed originally in 1964, said that any school district that had schools with more than 50% of its students as minorities had to adopt a racial imbalance plan to address the situation. I think the impetus for passing it in 1965 was for the state to do something when the Boston School Committee and the city obviously were not doing anything.
In August 1965, Governor John Volpe signs the Racial Imbalance Act, which makes Massachusetts the first state in the country to proactively pass legislation to try to address school desegregation. It was a bit like a statewide version of the Brown versus Board decision nearly a decade earlier. On paper, it meant that Massachusetts was committing itself to take real action to address school segregation.
It became clear immediately after the passage by the Mass Legislature of the Racial Imbalance Act that the Boston School Committee had no intention of integrating the school system. They resisted at every turn.
Mrs. Hicks, is there a racial imbalance in Boston schools?
If you mean predominantly ethnic groupings in our schools, yes, there is racial imbalance, which merely reflects the geographic content of the neighborhood. But if you mean by racial imbalance, inferior schools, we do not have racial imbalance in the Boston public schools.
The Boston School Committee saw it as a threat to their control and their power over how schools functioned in Boston. While the Racial Imbalance Act had recommendations and policies for how school committees should address issues of racial imbalance in cities, Boston School Committee didn't want to hear it. It is only the idea of using buses to transport students that really gets the attention of Boston School Committee. They latch onto that issue of busing.
I feel that busing has no advantages educationally for our little children. It will take them far from their neighborhoods, and it will bring them into very strange neighborhoods.
The school committee goes through the motions of filing plans to desegregate the schools that it knows will be rejected. Some of them are silly and farcical. The school committee didn't accept the necessity to file the plans, and the penalty, the withdrawal of aid, wasn't something that was enough to get them to move.
Often politicians created the impression that, in fact, somehow the obligation to racially integrate the schools would go away.
Year after year, Mrs. Hicks would get a legislator to file a repeal bill.
So you want the complete repeal of the 1965 racial imbalance law?
Yes, I do, because it is actually to a detriment to the school children of Boston, and it is very costly to the taxpayers.
Year after year, support for repealing the racial imbalance law actually grew.
There were a lot of factors at play for those white Bostonians who opposed school desegregation.
Some people really didn't want to put their kids on a bus to another neighborhood. They were terrified. They didn't own a car if something happened. they would have a hard time getting there. Others were, quite frankly, very racist, and they did not want their child to go to school with someone from another ethnic group. That was real. That was real too.
In Charlestown, it was mostly Irish. Everybody knew everybody. Most of the marriages were townie marrying townie.
We grew up in the projects. A lot of divorced parents, a lot of alcoholic parents. When my dad died, my mom had to get a real job, she said, so she worked for the telephone company. She wasn't on welfare. She worked hard, and these are her children, and no one's going to tell her what to do with them. She thought it was wrong that they could take a whole bunch of poor kids from one community and stick them into another school, not giving them anything else.
If I had to bust my child, I'd keep her home. As I said before, I'll go to court, I'll fight it. I will not let her be bused anywhere.
The whole sense of the integration was a challenge to people. I don't think it's gonna be better if my kids go across the city to Dorchester or Roxbury or wherever. I know if they stay here in Charlestown, that they're gonna have an education, they're gonna have a job, and they're gonna have friends around them for life.
The people behind the racial imbalance law were people from wealthier leafy suburbs, communities with schools that were 100% white. Therefore, the racial imbalance law wouldn't apply to them.
In 1965, a white school committee man from suburban Brookline, Leon Trilling, comes up with the idea, why don't we have a program that buses black young people from Roxbury to suburban schools? He brings this idea to Ruth Batson, who embraced the idea. So in September 1966, 220 black students from Boston go to 7 suburban school systems. And that's the start of the METCO program.
Ruth Batson was a huge force behind the creation of METCO and ended up working for it, recruiting the kids, working with the schools. She said, I want the best that white people have to offer. I don't want the worst. The suburbs had all kinds of equipment that schools in the city didn't have, and she wanted that for black children.
7 transportation companies were hired to pick up 220 Negro children in the METCO program. Most of the stops are in Roxbury. Some are in neighboring North Dorchester, another Negro community in Boston. The ride on a METCO bus takes up to 1 hour and 5 minutes. The integration program is hardly massive this year. At Braintree's East Junior High School, for example, there were 10 Negro students to about 1,200 whites.
The METCO program was quite limited. The other issue is that these suburban communities, they're doing everything they can to oppose affordable housing that would actually have meaningful integration in their suburbs.
Louise Day Hicks had always been politically ambitious. She had always wanted to be mayor of Boston. 1967 seemed to be a perfect time for it.
Let me give you a stick. Now, when you use it, you have to say, stick with Hicks on the 26th, okay?
She ran against Kevin White, who was Secretary of State of Massachusetts.
All right. That's right. Chivalry isn't dead. That means men are still polite. What's your name?
Hello, nice meeting you.
He was a candidate that liberals would vote for.
Kevin White had a big vision that Boston could be a world-class city. He ran against Louise Day Hicks in a very racially charged election.
The motto of her campaign was, "You know where I stand."
And that meant, you know, I stand with you, the white community, in opposition to the interests and demands of the black community.
You know, it doesn't matter what the color of her mother's skin is. She wants her little child in the neighborhood school. If you ask me, you know where I stand. You know where I stand. I stand on behalf of all the people of Boston.
As a very serious citizen of Roxbury,
I'd like to know exactly what are you going to do?
Good morning. How are you?
What would you do? Go ahead, shake hands.
How are you?
If you intend to be the mayor of Boston, I think you should talk to everybody.
I'll be very happy to.
Here.
I'll be very happy to.
Now, here, just like you talk to everybody else at the station. Why ignore me?
I feel that the people of Boston have found their leader. Now, as history records her, she'll be only recorded as a person that created bigotry, created division, created hate.
Mrs. Hicks scared the hell out of Kevin White because she was doing pretty well. And then Kevin White went to the black community to get the black vote. So they rallied. They voted.
White has won the election with 100,820 votes.
Kevin White prevailed because people were disgusted with Boston's parochialism. They knew that there needed to be a spark or Boston was going to be a historical footnote. People were desperate for change, but it was a narrow fight, and I think it was for the soul of the city.
Are you happy? Tonight is a night of celebration for all of us.
This is a CBS News special report.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene.
I remember somebody came in and said they've killed King, Dr. King. You could feel the floor drop out from under people. Martin was more than a preacher and a leader. We were all ennobled by him. We were all raised up by him. He said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Have faith. We'll get there. And suddenly that's gone. When he died as a leader in the way that he died, it was devastating. I felt devastated by it. Yeah. So I'm still mourning him. After Dr. King was assassinated, it was very personal for all of us. We were saying to ourselves, if this country can't take care of us, we need to figure out how to take care of ourselves.
Well, it's my feeling the main problem is irrelevant and racist education at the school, and that the young people are fed up with it.
Excuse me, but what do you mean by racist education?
They have no instruction in Afro-American history. The orientation is all around European and Western cultures. The music that is called, referred to as classical or important music is Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. It's not James Brown and Otis Redding. And that's kind of that institutional kind of racism. In addition to that, we have a history of problems with individual teachers who are prejudiced. And it's nothing to be ashamed of, but something that must be dealt with.
The movement towards more community control of the schools resulted in getting a black principal in the King School, ultimately. It was a big victory. Then community momentum shifted to the Gibson School.
The Gibson School was an old building in an African-American community primarily. It was under-resourced, very few materials. There was a certain fear of children, really, in the school, but also locked doors. They were kind of a symbol of keeping parents out. As the first day of school neared, we were aware of this building tension in the community. We really didn't know what was going to happen the first day of school, but we knew something was going to happen. There was an announcement that a number of parents had entered the school and were in the principal's office. The community had installed an alternative principal, Ben Scott. He was a nuclear chemist. He had been working with the community activists to try to improve schools.
We went to the office and told the principal that she could no longer operate that school, that we were, as parents, going to take over the school. We went to the teachers and told them they could stay if they chose to do so.
Mel King came to my room and taught a lesson to my fourth graders. He just radiated positive energy. He was a community leader who I had seen on television. So, wow, when he walked into my room that day, I was so excited. And the kids got it. They were quiet and listening.
The next day, there were a number of policemen at the school door.
They would let the teachers in, but nobody else.
If we cannot go into the school, we will not allow our children to go in. So we left that school. And honestly, I didn't know where we were going, but I knew we weren't going in there. Our children were not going to go in.
Bill Owens walks out and grabs the parents, and they follow him. He looks behind him, he finds there's a bunch of teachers, white teachers, that come with him.
We were doing what they felt was right for the kids in the moment. We were trying to make things better in a desperate situation. And so we chose to support the parents. Everybody goes inside to the Robert Gould Shaw House, and the teachers begin trying to organize little classrooms.
The primary purpose for keeping the children out of the Gibson school is that we want community-controlled school. We want a principal in the school who is approved by the parents of the Gibson school.
Our firing by the head of the school committee was pretty immediate. No hearing, no anything.
What do you plan to do now?
What next? What will you do?
We don't really know.
We haven't decided. We'll still be teaching, of course, any children from the Gibson School District who will be available to us.
You will be there Monday morning then?
We will be with the Gibson children wherever they are Monday morning.
The decision was made by the parents and others to set up this Gibson Liberation School. And so a lot of people descended immediately to help us. There were people who brought materials, books about Black kids and Black families that were relevant to the kids.
Upon inspecting the school tomorrow morning, if you do in fact find that there are no police there, will you then be ready to negotiate with the school committee without any other preconditions?
Yes, we would be. We would be ready, yes.
You have no right to enter this building.
I've been authorized to enter
By
the
whom?
building by the parents.
The parents have no right to give you any authorization to enter this building. If you enter this building, I'm telling you, you are trespassing. I'm warning you now. You're on school property right now, and you are to remove yourself from school property, or we'll have you removed.
People called the parents on the phone and said they were going to cut off their welfare, were going to be evicted if they didn't send their kids back to school. The parents were afraid.
In November, the parents decided to close the Liberation School, go back to continue the fight at the Gibson School. The kids all lined up, and they sang at the top of their voices, lift every voice, and sing, all the way back to the Gibson School. Ring with the harmonies of liberty.
After Louise Day Hicks ran for mayor and lost, she was no longer a member of the school committee. The school committee finally agreed to use desegregation money to build new schools.
The Lee School was one of a number of new schools built between Black and white neighborhoods. The school department had a plan to assign students from neighboring white schools and neighboring Black schools into this beautiful new facility with everything you can imagine, but began to encounter a great deal of resistance from parents whose children attended the Fifield or the O'Hearn school, which were both predominantly white.
Approximately 200 children continue to come to the Fifield School today, even though they were assigned to the Lee. And the same held true at the Patrick O'Hearn, a few blocks away.
A turning point in the whole desegregation saga took place. After school had started, there was a meeting at the O'Hearn School, and the school committee was deciding whether to reconsider its vote to open the school as a racially balanced school or not.
I am making the motion that parents of the children in the former O'Hearn and Fifield school districts be allowed to make their own decisions.
John Craven decided to reverse his vote, to vote not to open the school as a racially balanced school, and to kind of acquiesce to the demands of the parents to not bus their children there.
So at this point, the Black community in Boston has tried everything. They've tried the ballot box, they've tried direct action, they've tried the State House, and really, it hasn't worked. None of it has worked. So some of them felt it was time to do the last option, which was the court system.
In March 1972, lawyers for the NAACP, on behalf of plaintiffs, 14 parents and 44 children, filed suit charging the Boston Public Schools with de jure segregation, that you have intentionally segregated the schools.
After the NAACP achieves its monumental victory in Brown versus Board of Education, it's clear that the principle should apply in the North. The reality was that schools were segregated by race nationwide. So those lawyers litigate a series of cases in northern cities that seek to establish that schools that are in fact segregated by race in northern cities should be desegregated just the same as those in southern cities.
The judge in the Boston school desegregation case was W. Arthur Garrity. He was very different from the typical personality of a federal judge, as sort of bang the gavel, take charge, forceful. He was a thoughtful, reflective person.
Plaintiffs had to prove that the segregation of the Boston public schools, which was basically an undisputed fact, was the result of deliberate policies by the Boston School Committee. It was very easy after Brown versus the Board of Education for plaintiffs in southern cities to prove their case.
Across the southern states, there were laws that said officially black kids would go to this school, white kids would go to that school. In the North, there were not statutes of that nature. A lot of the proof for the trial ended up being easier than we had anticipated. One of the most amazing things about the Boston School Committee was that they literally had a stenographer that would take down every single word that was said in their public meetings. So we had verbatim transcripts of exactly the thoughts that they were thinking.
Those transcripts became very, very important evidence during the trial. There were numerous comments made by individual school committee members which revealed their true intentions.
What was probably the most surprising was all of the fiendishly clever different kinds of arrangements that they made to create and to promote segregation. One was the feeder pattern for schools. You had this literal dual school system where black kids would go elementary to middle school and a 4-year high school. Whites would go elementary to junior high and a 3-year high school. A black student would be finished with middle school, but there'd be no white high school with a 9th grade for him to go to.
There were many instances where black population in a particular area increased dramatically. And what did the school committee do? They would build some fairly small schools adjacent to these African-American areas, which virtually ensured that those schools would quickly become filled up with African-American students.
Another major device that the school department used was called open enrollment, the right of any student to go to any other school, quote, so long as there was space available. Very frequently, white students in an overcrowded school would be bused past a nearby, predominantly black school that had space available in order to go further away to an overcrowded white school where they would add portable classrooms. 30,000 students every day were bused or used other transportation for segregation.
There were decisions that were constantly being made which only made sense from a racial standpoint. And when you added into that mix pejorative comments, it just became very clear that the Boston School Committee had deliberately maintained a dual school system.
The question of racial imbalance in Boston schools is now before a federal court. If you had to guess at this point, what do you think that court will say?
Well, I would hope and I would believe that the court would uphold the feelings of many of us that schools should be desegregated in Boston.
There was a long period of time between the trial and Judge Garrity's ultimate ruling. It was over a year.
He was under a tremendous amount of pressure, including from Mayor White, to come out with his decision.
On June 21st, 1974, Judge Garrity ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and he found that the school committee was guilty of maintaining a dual school system, one for black students and one for whites, that was unconstitutionally segregated.
The opinion was extraordinary in its detail. Garrity wanted to make sure that anybody who took the time to read the opinion would agree with the result.
The facts that the judge points to as unlawful, the using of feeder schools, transfer policies, school assignment policies to segregate the schools are observable in many school systems in the country. That would mean that many school systems are segregated, following the logic of Morgan.
After a judge has found that a school system is unconstitutionally segregated, that situation has to be remedied. Many people felt that the city schools should be integrated along with suburban schools.
We prefer a metropolitan solution for the problem, and in terms of every kind of social fairness, a metropolitan solution would be much better.
That's what had happened in Detroit. The black parents had said, we've been discriminated against, but the Detroit schools are nearly 100% black already, so that the only effective way to have desegregation is to bring in the suburbs. That case, Milliken against Bradley, was at the United States Supreme Court and being argued at essentially the exact same time.
Late in July of 1974, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled there was simply no legal basis for including surrounding towns in the remedy phase of the case.
Tragically, Milliken went down to defeat 5-4. If Milliken had been affirmed, Detroit and Boston would have ended up with a suburban, metropolitan solution. We would have had a pooling of resources. If we want to do something fundamentally about educational opportunity and integration, you have to involve more than just the inner city.
In his dissent, Justice Thurgood Marshall, who had been the chief lawyer who represented the black plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education, makes the point that the court had taken a giant step backwards from Brown. It was deciding a constitutional law case based not on logic and legal precedent, but based on white resistance.
In 1973, the State Board of Education had developed a desegregation plan for Boston because Boston officials refused to do it. The state Supreme Court had ordered that the state plan be implemented in September 1974.
As an interim measure, Judge Garrity commanded that the Boston School Committee comply with the order that had been issued by the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. It really was an effort by him to have the city of Boston comply with an order that it already should have been complying with.
The plan, which would affect 40% of the city, calls for the busing of 19,000 junior high school and high school students. And it was just what all these busing opponents who'd been fighting all these years were afraid of.
Many people were very hopeful that something would actually change now. Others were scared about what was going to happen because there was going to be resistance.
I think there was a sense of euphoria, relief, excitement, vindication, jubilation, combined with the sense of, now what do we do?
We mobilized the A-team. We had a boiler room. We hired hundreds of new employees as school crossing guards, as bus monitors, as schoolroom aides.
But the issue became the election, the racial imbalance law.
Kevin White had 100 coffee clutches. He knew that at a minimum, white parents needed to be listened to.
I love raising my children here, but yet I feel that we should be able to solve our own problems and not having outsiders come and do it.
I agree with you.
Mayor White would have these parent meetings, and he would say things like, this is going to be hard. It's going to be like the South, but we can get through this.
Secondly, it'll be a painful process going through it because the South didn't just slide through it. It tore them apart as it will help to tear us apart.
That was his message. Ruth Batson always said, not one politician, including the mayor of this city, ever said this is the right thing to do.
Kevin White was contemptuous of the scheme that Judge Garrity imposed. But did Kevin White ever once say, I won't enforce it? No. Now, was he a profile in courage? No. And I don't recall any other elected officials being profiles in courage during busing. They all headed for the hills.
One of the great ironies in this entire busing situation was that it's likely that most African-American parents would have preferred not to bus their kids. They would have preferred to have their kids in schools in their neighborhoods that were high quality.
There was not a unified African-American community as it relates to school desegregation. Many black parents were saying, what are you thinking about, NAACP? This is crazy. No, we can't send our kids into the lion's den.
People were generally afraid for their children. The fear going to South Boston, the fear going to Charlestown, the fear going to all-white schools where black people actually didn't live, made most parents very cautious.
Garrity's decision deepened the opposition to busing. They were going to oppose it with every fiber of their being.
I will not pledge allegiance to the order of the United States Court, nor to the dictatorship for which it stands. One order.
As the busing order became more and more real, people tried to enroll their children into parish schools that weren't part of their parish. And the Archbishop of Boston, Humberto Carlos Medeiros, says, no, you can't do that. The church's position was, this is a court order. Not only are we going to obey it, but it's the right thing to do.
A lot of people had so much to say, to tell us what we had to do here in this community, but nothing was happening to them. They weren't being forced. It bothered me that people would have a lot to say about us, but They don't live here.
Charlestown was a nitty-gritty place. There was the largest housing project in the city, more than 1,000 units of, it was grimy, it was old. The people in Charlestown felt betrayal. That after negotiations with a lot of the urban renewal projects, as part of the quid pro quo, I guess you'd call it, they had been promised 2 new schools, the Warren Prescott School and the Kent School. They felt as though they were taken away from them. These new schools were no longer their schools. They were someone else's schools.
We were told, no, 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 no. Your kid cannot go to that school. Wouldn't you be upset? Wouldn't anybody be upset? Of course we're upset. We're upset about our rights. Our kids could have gone from pre-kindergarten to community college and never leave the town. And we were very happy with that.
In phase 1 of the busing plan, South Boston High School and Roxbury were paired. South Boston's lower end, which is where I'm from, held one of the highest concentrations of white poverty in America. We were not working class, we were poor. To focus on a school that had a lot of students on welfare, that's not really the place to get equity.
Black parents were smart enough to know that the education their kids were going to get at South Boston High School was not what they aspired to. And the white community knew that their kids were being bused into inferior schools in the black community.
We'll fight. The group was formed. ROAR, Restore Our Alienated Rights, by Louise Day Hicks and others in South Boston.
Tonight, let us unite and do it Roar's way. Our kids.
Its meetings were held in the Boston City Council chambers in City Hall, that by this time Louise Day Hicks was on. She posted big letters in the windows that spelled out ROAR. And anyone passing by in the City Hall Plaza could look up and see what seemed to be the official endorsement of ROAR by City Hall.
You see his name is Garrity. You know darn well he can go to hell. We'll do it Roar's way.
We had motorcades to draw attention and noise to the whole town that we're against this. And we drove by Garrity's house in Wellesley. It was exciting. How can that be exciting? But as a teenager, with all that activity, that is one way I would describe the experience.
It all culminated that fall just before school opened with a 10,000-person demonstration in Government Center.
Today, the people who gathered on City Hall Plaza were angry. Their battle against busing has been lost. They said they were coming to tell Senators Kennedy and Brooke exactly how the city feels about their consistent support for busing.
I can remember it was an angry, angry time. No matter what we said, all these people that we looked up to at one time in our lives were turning against us.
Our senior senator, Ted Kennedy, is walking through City Hall Plaza surrounded by a crowd of angry anti-busing activists who confronted him, jostled him. Kennedy took a punch in the gut. I was there, I saw it. His aides were helping him evade the crowd, which was getting angrier and angrier.
Security got the senator into the building safely. And a number of folks just started pounding on the glass. And it broke.
And if that glass had shattered on Ted Kennedy, he could have been killed. 30-foot high plate glass shattering is something to behold. It was a very scary moment. There was no dialogue during this period. There was only historical division and hatred. this was just as polarized, just as ugly as any place on the earth.
Good evening. As we all know, in 3 days, the city of Boston will face one of her greatest challenges, busing.
That night, Kevin White asked for permission from local television to give a speech. I wrote a speech and he delivered it.
To every mother and father, I pledge tonight that your mayor and that your police department will tolerate no threat to the well-being of your children.
Right after Kevin White delivered his speech, the police commissioner informed us that Whitey Bulger, who was then a notorious gangster, was planning to shoot and kill black children as the buses rolled on what they called opening day. We were at the precipice of anarchy, civil war. What you could feel was the palpable fear and animosity that just hung over the city, like an explosion just waiting for a match to be lit.
The morning of, you hear the helicopters. Started at 6. It just accentuated the tension that was in the community.
The first day was anticipated to be chaotic, and it was. There were lots of people who were there to watch what was going on. There were truckfuls of cameras and everything else. The kids hadn't even come yet.
I was assigned to South Boston High School. I had a new outfit for the first day of school because no sophomore could wear clothes that they wore in their freshman year. I was looking forward to, going to a football or a basketball game. I was looking forward to having friends and some after-school activities.
The first 3 buses, please. South Boston High School now loading.
I met the police commissioner and then the superintendent. We went to South Bay, which is where the buses were going to come, and basically form a wagon train going up the heights to South Boston High School.
We get to a certain point, and all you see is a sea of people with signs and yelling at the students that are on the bus. I wondered to myself, why would a person get up that early in the morning to taunt black students?
They were greeted with an angry crowd, yelling the N-word and literally throwing bananas at some of the black kids. It was the ugliest that I've ever experienced human nature.
As the kids were getting out of the buses, thousands of residents from South Boston were screaming at the black students, "Nigger, go home. Nigger, go home."
There were very few white students going to school that first day because the anti-busing side had called for a boycott of schools.
I had 35 kids assigned to each class, and less than half of those kids came to my class. One of the reasons why they boycotted was they were hoping that they would rescind the order and allow their children to go to South Boston High School. It was kind of a waiting game for them.
The desegregation plan for the first year, the sophomores would be bused from Roxbury to South Boston High School. The junior class was supposed to go to Roxbury, and the seniors could choose either South Boston or Roxbury.
At Roxbury High School, in the heart of a black district, most of the buses sent to bring in white students arrived empty or with only a few passengers. Only 234 pupils, 20 whites and 214 blacks, came to school. The student body is supposed to be about 900.
I think it's going to be all right if everybody comes and stop being scared, because, shoot,
I don't think there's nothing to be scared of.
How do you think things are going to work out here at Roxbury High?
I guess to work out all right. If the parents just stay out of it all and let the kids work it out for themselves, it'll be all right.
Most of the teachers and administrators, they tried to keep us away from the windows because of what was going on outside.
At least twice, stones and bottles began to fly, and the police charged, led by policemen on horseback. The police charges cleared the way for the buses to pick up the black students at the end of the day.
It's clear whites who do not want blacks in their schools are acting in just the same way as violent whites in the South.
I'm not uncomplicit in this. If you saw it on the television, I was there. There was a sense that we were going to lose our community. I had no interest in throwing bricks or a rock, and most people didn't. We weren't raised that way, but it happened. People throwing bricks and rocks.
I was 8 years old, but I needed to feel or pretend that I was part of this thing. Throwing a rock was part of being of the mob, of the us.
When we got to the staging area, waiting for the buses to come back, we saw that the buses had broken windows. It was painful because the kids were coming out crying. Some parents showed up. Some of the kids didn't have their parents to support them.
When I reported to Kevin White on opening day that no black child had been killed, we thought that was a victory. It was the saddest day in Boston's history. But if a black child had been killed, there would have been a civil war.
That night, black leaders were enraged because the public safety of their kids was in jeopardy. They called a meeting to which they invited Mayor White to make it quite clear to him, we expect you to make sure that our kids are safe. We are not going to accept anything but that, and you are not doing that.
It was a very tough night for Kevin White to face angry, frightened black parents because he had promised them that their children would be safe, and they weren't. He had to admit that he had failed, and he asked for their forgiveness. But he wasn't able to deliver on the first and most important obligation that any leader has, which is to keep his community safe.
Black leaders had to make a tough decision to ask black parents to stay the course. Tough decision. All along the way, black parents have had to make very difficult decisions in order to assert their rights and to use their kids in the process.
We're so proud of you kids. I know it takes courage, and I know it's fear when they throw rocks and bottles at you. But we're determined. If you kids want an education, you're going to get it.
The second day, the black students had to be escorted by Boston police officers because of what happened on the first day.
How long do you anticipate the need for police protection for the kids going to South Boston?
As long as it's necessary.
Is it a possibility that it would continue till next June, till school's out?
Oh, I don't think so. Certainly not planning on it, but we'll be here if it's necessary.
We had marching orders to go out and get stories that were forceful, that ignited passion.
Let them move next door to me, I don't care. But don't send my kids all over Timbuktu.
If anybody is yelling, make sure you get that. And if they get angry with you, make sure you show that. These were the stories that were picked up by the networks. So the nation saw a city in turmoil, a city ready to explode, because that's how we were covering it.
When you look at the protests against desegregation, it was mostly at the high school level. There was a very small number of schools where there was violence.
There were 3 geographic enclaves that still had semblances of a neighborhood school system. They were South Boston, Charlestown, and East Boston. Because they were so geographically isolated, they were still sending their kids to neighborhood schools. Those 3 neighborhoods fought hardest to keep what they had, and South Boston, being the only one involved the first year, fought first.
I just remember we got on the van with the black teachers because it was safe for white teachers, but it wasn't safe for black teachers to drive their cars up there. We got in a caravan with the school buses, motorcycle escorts, patrol cars, and I said, wow, this is how you start your day. It's like you're going to an armed encampment. By the time the kids even got off the bus, they were tense. Each day, your stomach would knot up.
You've had a chance now to watch for 3 weeks how this school is going to operate logistically, day in and day out. Have you formed an opinion yet on whether or not education can be accomplished, if teaching can go on in this kind of circumstance?
I've formed opinions.
What's your opinion?
I think it's almost self-evident. Come on, go to school or go home. Come on, La Rosa, let's go. Come on.
Dr. Reed, the principal, he really cared about the kids, but was almost powerless to do anything because he had no control. The community outside was controlling the kids.
I woke up in the morning thinking about what's going to happen inside of the building that day. White students was often called black students a nigger. Sometimes they would make like a grunting sound like we were apes.
It's tense. It's always tense in the class because you never know when a fight's gonna break out. I mean, you give someone a wrong look and they jump right on your back.
The black kids didn't go over there to start trouble. Black kids were scared. So the kids who initiate a lot of the fighting was white kids. When fights occurred, black kids were being jumped, but they were being suspended.
My brother could not take the bullying, the harassment. He eventually stopped attending school.
Going over there to me is like going to a war. Because that's all we do over there is fight.
You can't get an education and watch your back at the same time.
Black kids went through a heck of a lot to go to South Boston High School, to go and get an education where they weren't welcome. They paid a heavy price. And white kids paid a heavy price because that community used those kids like pawns and sacrificed their education as well.
At the end of the second period, the bell rang, and I went out of the corridor. I noticed there were a large bunch of white youngsters. A book bag came hurtling out of the crowd towards these 2 black boys. And as the white kids turned to flee, one of the black youngsters came forward and stabbed one of the white boys. My God, I was just in shock.
I was going into the main office. I heard voices saying, "The niggers killed him, they killed him." And then this, chaos inside of the building.
I went to the office and I told the secretary, call an ambulance. And then there was a communication. White students leave the building. All black students should go to their classrooms.
When the kids were dismissed and they said a white kid had got stabbed, of course that goes through the whole community. You know, and I went up to the high school.
The crowd had grown outside, and it had grown and grown.
There were a number of black students, a couple hundred maybe, they were trapped. It was an angry crowd saying pretty angry things. You know, busing back to Africa and, you know, all that stuff. Those kids definitely could hear the chants. I can't imagine. I can't imagine how those kids felt.
The crowd's anger spread to include not only the black students inside the school, but the policemen outside as well. Mounted police rode into the crowd in an effort to split it, but they were met by bricks, bottles, eggs, and verbal abuse. Missiles flew from the sidewalks, the back of the crowd, and from the rooftops.
Louise Day Hicks was on the front steps telling the crowd to let the students go back to Roxbury.
Now there's only one way to get them back to Roxbury, and that's to have them go back by bus. Okay, I'm going to ask you, will you please move to the other side of the street so they can
She looked frightened because she couldn't control them.
We were wondering, like, how are we going to get out of here? There was a sea of people, and it was so violent.
They came up with a brilliant plan. They sent decoy buses up to the front. At the same time that they would escort the black students to buses that were behind the school, we were waiting for the buses, never thinking the buses were already there in the back of the building.
The students ran out the back door to get on those buses. You could hear the crowd. All I could think of was what happened if that crowd had caught me. So I ran as fast as I possibly could to get on the bus. And I ducked, and I laid on the floor.
And they ran us on the buses, and they ran us out the school, and they were going to go down the back stairs. We had to walk all the way down Elm Street. And parents and everything was up there trying to hurt out.
Police dispersed the crowd, and that was the end of that day. We teachers went out to the car, and I remember a bird flew over. We all ducked because everything was so fearful.
South Boston High School reopened today for the first time in almost a month. Only about 1/4 of the students showed up today, and at the main building, there were more police than students.
When you walked into the building, there were metal detectors where students had to go through. In the hallways, you had state troopers every 10 feet or so. So it was almost as if you were in prison. As a student, it was really difficult for learning because of the tension in the building. Some of the teachers did try, but there was a lot, in my opinion, that just tried to get through the day.
There were kids who came in every day, basically. There were some kids who would walk into the classroom and I'd say, "Ooh, who are you?" You know?
These are a few of the things that we should know about lay attitude.
Many parents are balking at court-ordered desegregation. In fact, they've taken it a step further and set up their own underground or alternative schools. These schools are not accredited and therefore they're not legal.
I actually was a volunteer teacher, the South Boston Information Center, where the rallies were planned in the front room, in the same mimeograph where you would run off the flyers. I would run off my papers for class.
There's also an alternative school for black children in Boston. Set up for many of the same reasons, parents are afraid to send their children into hostile, perhaps dangerous environments and choose instead to set up their own schools.
Cardinal Medeiros had decreed that Catholic schools should not be a refuge for those seeking to leave the public schools, and it was widely ignored.
If you didn't like getting bused to Roxbury, you just went to your local parish parochial school. If you worked the bingo on Friday night and cleaned up afterwards, X numbers of dollars would be taken off your tuition.
By the end of the first year of busing, 10,000 children had been withdrawn from the Boston public school system.
How do you speak to the frequent allegation that what we're doing is creating or inciting or urging on this white flight, the argument that is probably most often used here, that you're going to destroy the city?
Very simple answer. If the price of whites staying is blacks losing constitutional rights and educational benefits, let them go. Simple answer.
Judge Garrity had ordered the state plan into effect in September 1974. It was not a plan that eliminated segregation root and branch, which was the phrase of the Supreme Court decisions. So a more comprehensive plan needed to be developed. Judge Garrity ordered that the Boston School Committee come up with a plan and gave them a deadline in mid-December to do that.
The committee is under a court order to file a second phase desegregation plan this Monday. The question remaining is, will the school committee approve the plan and send it on to Judge Garrity?
People are leaving the city, people are leaving the school system. I cannot in good conscience add to that bloodshed, add to that racial hatred, and add to the further fleeing of the city from the people of Boston. And I will not vote approval of this plan.
When it came time to submit it to the court, the school committee members said, "We refuse. We won't do it. We'll do nothing to aid or abet forced busing." On behalf of the black parents and the black students, we asked Judge Garrity to find the school committee in criminal and civil contempt.
Why didn't the judge hold them in contempt? I don't understand why, given how they ignored and abused and flaunted his orders, they were let off the hook.
Garrity commissioned his experts, Robert Dentler and Marvin Scott, to come up with another plan called Phase 2. Phase 2 increased the number of students to be bused. Instead of just junior high school and high school students, it was students from grades 1 to 12.
Garrity ordered more black teachers to be hired, more black administrators to be hired, and for those to be assigned schools on a desegregated basis.
Garrity recognized that there was almost no parent involvement, so the racial ethnic parent councils were established. It was literally the first time in the history of the city where large numbers of black and white parents and some Latino and Asian parents sat together. This would be a revolution in the city of Boston.
We move into the summer 1975. The scene shifts to Charlestown, which is now part of the busing plan for the first time. It was now going to lose its neighborhood school system if it adhered to the Phase 2 requirements.
There was a sense in Charlestown, it was like a tsunami, it was coming. It was a foreboding. It pervaded everything. It's one thing to read about it in the newspaper, but to walk into it and to feel it and get a sense that, yeah, it's not in their best interest in many ways.
What is the attitude of the parents that you have contact with? Are many students going to even return to Charlestown High this fall?
We've transferred as many as 6 to 8 students each week since June 20th.
Where are these students heading?
Generally, they're moving into what I would call lower middle class areas in surrounding communities on the north side of the city.
My mother joined Powder Keg with all her friends. It was an organization of Charlestown mothers that were here to help try to fight forced busing. My mother said, if you want to go to school, you can go to school. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I decided to go to school because I really wanted to go to Charlestown High. It was something I was looking forward to. If I had been signed to Roxbury, I wouldn't have gone. I did not want to get on a bus.
Do you think that the project has been hit particularly hard by busing as opposed to the rest of Charlestown?
Well, I think you'd find the project has had to bear the greater brunt of children who've had to leave Charlestown to go to school.
Why is that?
I think that my own experience is that the other sections of Charlestown, that the kids have either gone to parochial schools or have gone to private schools.
There were several evenings in the summer in which parents from Roxbury were bused into Charlestown High School, and I can remember black parents coming out and saying, I don't want my kid going to this school. My kid's getting bused at this school. It's a dump.
During the first phase of busing, we wanted as light a police presence as possible. We didn't want to antagonize the crowd. But clearly, the tactics we adopted that first day were inadequate. So the second year, it was an entirely different approach, and it was a much more massive physical presence of police.
The implementation plan called for 997 police officers. They were in attendance. Also, state police in South Boston had a complement of 499. The MDC in South Boston, there were 82. This is at South Boston. Also, the MDC at Charlestown were 215.
First day of busing was, everybody was on eggshells. What's going to happen? The buses are going to come. Which way are they coming? They went on the streets and figured if we're on the streets, the buses aren't going to run us over. We can stop busing by being on the streets and blocking the buses. But the police just put up a blockade and the buses went a different route.
I got out early, and the helicopters were overhead. There were snipers on the buildings. The place was ringed with police, and it was chaotic.
I met up with my two friends. We had on our matching Coca-Cola pants and our little shirts to match. I just remember motorcycle cops up and down the street, and it sounded like, you know, Nazi Germany instead of, you know, your first day of school. As you got to the square, there were a sea of cameras everywhere.
Charlestown was like the center of the universe. There were reporters from all over the place. We had Japanese reporters. I'm just saying, what is a Japanese reporter from Tokyo doing here covering busing? It's, you know.
We walked up the hill. There are people who don't want us to go to school. People were yelling, you know, calling us names, UN lover, you know, stay out of the building. Some people really believe that if everybody stayed out of school and didn't go, then busing would not be an issue.
Why ain't I going to school? I'm boycotting.
How come?
How come? What do you think? The cops are up there. They're locking the schools from the outside. Plus this busing. I don't want nothing to do with it.
How long are you going to stay out?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners.
During the daytime, the mothers would march and they'd take the little kids with them, and maybe the baby carriage.
They protested in the street. Sit down. Sit down in the street. They did it sometimes to aggravate, as opposed to expecting any real success in anything.
There were 14 arrests in Boston today, bringing the total since schools opening to 94. 9 policemen have been injured, mainly in nighttime disturbances.
I see that car in the area again.
At night, when it got dark, it was a little bit more ugly, and there were objects thrown at the police, windows were broken, Molotov cocktails or bottles like that, and it could have just exploded.
Last night, a mob of several hundred people started stoning civilian cars and setting fires in the streets, and then attacked responding firefighters. It was this mob that then attacked police, attempting to protect the citizens and the firefighters. The quickest way we can get the city back to normal is to stop the troublemakers.
But the police were very restrained. They knew these people.
The police department was trying to police their own people, basically. I think they were lenient, to say the least, on some of those issues. Some of the district court judges had an umbrage against Judge Garrity. They were more concerned about the perpetrator than the victim during those days.
I think the cops, whatever else you may say, are doing a first-rate job.
Let me ask you a question. If the kind of scenes, crowd scenes, you've encountered in Charlestown, the crowds were white, was to be taking place in Roxbury, where the crowds were black, do you for 1 minute think that we would have a situation like we have today, where the total arrests that have been made over there have been less than 20? Do you for 1 minute think that would prevail? That's the answer to your question. We're dealing with the double standard of law enforcement, and as long as that continues, then we're going to continue to have a problem where people will think they can enforce the law on the street with their fists or with a rock or with a bottle.
One of the difficulties in the schools was the influence of the adults inciting and plotting and planning for the kids to, 10 o'clock, 10:30, going to walk out. And we'll get the press there, okay?
They would plan at powder keg the night before and would let kids know and then say, okay, as soon as the bell rings, everybody stay in your seat. Don't anybody leave.
The children have a series of demands to make. The school authorities don't want to listen to the demands while they're still seated inside the school.
I remember being picked up physically by policemen to bring us outside the building. Some kids just did it just so they could get out of school. So there was a lot of chaos going on, and everybody was joining in on it.
Of some 164 schools in Boston, there was a very small number of schools where there were violence. The vast majority of public schools in Boston were successfully desegregated. In the beginning, a lot of parents kept their kids out of school, black and white, mostly because, what does this mean?
You have a child, one child, two child, how many? You
I have two children, one going to the McKay in East Boston, and one going to the Kent in Charlestown. So I've been going in two directions to, sort of.
Will you still send them in light of what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think when I think it over, I will, but I'll be frightened and I'll be very nervous about it. But I think that we have to do it. We don't have a choice. And I want Phase 2 to work, and I just don't think we can boycott it.
You could find these white parents emerging in these white working class communities and saying, yes, segregation is wrong. We want something better for black children and something better for white children.
Maureen and I both supported public education. But it was a huge decision. We were going to send our kids on a bus as a first grader into Roxbury. So it took the summer for us to discuss that. All my neighbors, they thought we were nuts, putting them on a bus, having them get stoned at Savin Hill Ave because there were black kids in the bus. And then when they got to Roxbury, getting stoned by black kids because there were white kids on the bus. Unfortunately, it became almost normal. And that's a sad indictment for a 7 or 8-year-old kid.
There were very rational voices, people who were opposed to the racism, but also opposed to the busing plan, and who, once it happened, wanted to make it happen without the violence, wanted their kids to be safe and wanted other kids from across town who were Black to be safe.
Tracy Amalfitano and Jim literally lived right across the street. She actually joined biracial council. Tracy and others were deploring the violence and just trying to get folks to calm down. The one incident that's still seared into my memory. My brothers and I are, outside. Out of nowhere came a mob. They had bats. Tracy's station wagon got busted up with bats. Bricks or rocks thrown through the windows of Tracy's three-decker. So we're just stunned that this happens. And then it got worse in that several cars come down the street slowly. And in the cars were some women, and one of them had this eating grin. And the translation, this is what happens if you turn traitor on our community. I didn't go to any more rallies after that. It wasn't exciting anymore.
The culmination for most people of the violence happened in April of 1976. As Boston, the birthplace of liberty, the hotbed of abolition, was celebrating the Bicentennial.
We were going to march on City Hall, and I remember walking with my friend and her mom, and we're singing, and everybody's all riled up. As we got onto the plaza, there were a lot of people there.
I was walking across City Hall Plaza on my way to attend a meeting in City Hall. I realized that there was an anti-busing demonstration going on. Several of them started shouting, "There's a nigger, get him." The first person to attack me knocked my glasses off, and that caused me to fall. And then several other young men decided to start kicking me. I was able to pick myself up, and I could see that someone was swinging an American flag at me, really lunging at me with the flag.
I see this all happening, and I remember crying and saying, why is this happening? Because when you did these peaceful marches, you don't want people to think of us as, here come the troublemakers.
That evening, I got a call from the Boston police saying that a photographer had captured the incident, and they wanted me to see whether I could identify any of the young people. That was the first moment that I really got to see the expressions on the faces of these teenagers. It was clear that there was manifest hatred that several of the young men felt towards me.
The Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph became the world-famous emblem of hatred. The American flag, a Black professional walking through City Hall Plaza, and the violence that was inflicted upon him as a result of hatred.
The violence continued year to year. It was sporadic, hard to anticipate.
The tensions carried over from the school onto the streets. I don't even think it had nothing to do with busing anymore. Anytime something bad happened to a black person, something bad would happen to a white person.
At least 3 more incidents were reported today in the continuing racial violence in Boston.
It was like a retaliation throughout the city for a long time. People being pulled out of cars and beaten up and, you know, just terrible stuff.
People don't realize how very close this city came to just completely exploding. I'm talking about the whole city. It came very, very close.
In the middle of all this chaos, I wrote in my journal, Fiat justitia ruat caelum, do justice though the heavens fall. I remember reflecting then, what good will it do to do justice if the heavens fall? What would justice look like among the ruins?
If there had been a way for deep dialogue between blacks and whites, a lot of the conflict that arose during the 60s and 70s was avoidable. People were in a state of violent agreement. What we agreed about was the inefficacy of busing. White parents didn't want it for their kids. They had different motivations and different reasons. And black parents would have preferred not to have busing if they had had quality schools. We did not slow down, take a deep breath, take a step back, and ask ourselves what's possible together. That's a tragedy. Everybody has lost.